So here we are in another week of doing online services as we practice this social distancing to minimize the coronavirus pandemic. Now, last week I did a message on living through storms to help us to mentally, emotionally, and spiritually manage all the changes that COVID-19 has forced on our lives. We drew eternal, timeless principles from our storm and from God's Word, and we looked at what Jesus did when he was asleep in the boat, and then he awoke and he calmed the Sea of Galilee. In just a word, he brought the storm down to a perfect calm. Now, I want to digress just a tad and give you a bit of a marriage advice. In most cases, when a man and his wife are disagreeing on the details of something that's happened in their lives, the woman is right. I'll wait for the applause. And the reason she usually is right is because scientists think that she feels things more deeply than him, and so she remembers them better than he does. And so men don't seem to have quite the memory that women do in general. There are obviously exceptions, but in general that's true. I believe this is why television networks invented the instant replay, because a man has to be shown again what immediately happened because he's already forgot what he saw. So I don't care who you are, right there is funny, okay? Now, I want to do like an instant replay. I want to start this message with an instant replay of sorts from last week. And I want to review the last 4 points of that message because I think they're so critical for us to get and live in. Number one, if you have an outline, live the life that you're in. You don't have the one that you wished was. Live the life that you're in. You don't have the one that you wished was. We don't get to live in the fantasy that we wished was. We live in the reality that is. And we can't change the channel. The truth is that most of life is simply making the best of things that we wished weren't. Number two, change what you can and accept what you can't. Change what you can, accept what you can't. If you can change it, then it's a problem. If you can't change it, it's a fact of life. Don't ever mistake facts of lives for problems, or you'll waste a whole lot of energy trying to change something that you cannot change. Do what you can and then accept what you must. Happiness in this life only exists in imperfect circumstances. I want to say that again. Happiness in this life only exists in imperfect circumstances. There is no perfect down here. And so if you're going to be happy, you're going to be happy in less than perfect. So you change what you can, you accept what you can't. Number three, face what you must, when you must, but not before you must. Face what you must, when you must, but not before you must. Don't waste your spiritual, mental, and emotional energy worrying about what ifs. Most of our what ifs never become what is. But if your what if does become what is, God will give you all the strength you need for whatever it is that you have to face. Facing what you must, when you must, but not before you must, is what Jesus talked about in Matthew 6:34. And he said this, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." So Jesus gives us strength that we need for the day that we need it. He gives me today's strength for today's problems. He doesn't give me today the strength I need for today's problems, tomorrow's problems, the next day's problems, and the weekend's problems. So if I start borrowing tomorrow's what ifs, it leads to stress and fear and depression. Don't do it. Cross that river when you get there. God will show you how when you get there. Now, here's the fourth thing from last week. Knowing the end of your story will help you get through your story. Knowing the end of your story will help you get through your story. It makes it a whole lot easier to get through a difficult season in our lives, a chapter in our lives, when we know how the story ends. Life may be hard now, but it's heaven later. The truth is we can have the courage we need to live now because we don't have to be afraid of death. Whenever we die, and we all eventually will, we win. Every chapter except heaven has an ending. So whatever chapter we're in now, this coronavirus chapter, is going to have an ending. Every chapter has an ending, beginning, ending, and then we go on to the next chapter. When we get to heaven, then there's no other chapter after that. It's the one that doesn't change and has no ending. Now, I need to make a confession. I'm in no way seeking to create a cute little sermon outline tonight. I'm not trying to alliterate points and have a poem. What I do want to do is use God's word to help you know how to survive and even thrive in your storm. So I've taken today's passage and I've asked this question of it. What is it in this passage that will give life-changing help to those who need it? Pretty much it's what I do each time I speak. What is it in God's word will give people life-changing help that they need? So let's get going. We're talking about learning from storms. This is the second of these two messages. And turn in your Bible, if you haven't already, to Matthew 14. I'm going to read verses 22 to 33. Immediately, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, about 3 a.m, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, took hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You certainly are God's Son." So let's get in your outline and talk about the things tonight that we learn from storms. Number one, life is full of ups and downs, and sometimes the downs come right after the ups. Life is full of ups and downs, and sometimes the downs come right after the ups. If you look in your Bible at Matthew 14, 13 to 22, you'll realize that the storm came right after Jesus had fed the 5,000. Now it says there he fed 5,000 men, and there were women and children there. So it could have been 10,000, it could have been 12,000. He did so with a few fishes and loaves. What a high, what an up it must have been for those disciples to collect 12 full baskets of leftovers. In other words, they fed 10 to 15,000 people, and they had more food left over than they had when they started. What a high that must have been. Jesus had worked this miracle. Now, within the next 24 hours, the disciples are in a storm, fearing for their lives. Sometimes downs come right after ups. Here in America, we've been riding the greatest economic wave of all time. What a high. And then in a matter of weeks, a bull market becomes a bear market. Record employment is replaced by 3 million and growing unemployed people, and a large portion of our economy is shut down. What a low. What a high followed by a low. Elijah took on Ahab, Jezebel, and 1,000 false prophets. He called down fire from heaven. What a high. And then he became so depressed that he wished he could die. What a low. What an up, and then what a down. This is how life happens. It's full of ups and downs, and sometimes the downs come right after the ups. Now, number two. The second thing we learn from this storm, number two, is that following Jesus doesn't exempt you from storms, it guarantees several. Following Jesus doesn't exempt you from storms, it guarantees several. Some preachers preach and people live under the illusion that if they walk with God, they won't have problems and they won't have storms and trials. It just isn't true. To believe that, you got to live in massive denial because it isn't reality. If you look at verses 22 and 24, you'll see that the disciples were doing exactly what Jesus told them to do when their storm overpowered them. Everybody, good and bad, goes through storms. Following Jesus and doing what he says will get you into some storms. It did them. All of these disciples and Paul suffered for what God wanted them to do. Following him didn't enable them to avoid storms. It got them into storms that they might have avoided. Just the opposite. Now jot down 1 Peter 4:12. And there it says, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. Don't be surprised when you find yourself in a storm or in a trial. God doesn't always protect us from storms. You'll see in a minute, he likes to get into the storms with us and then use the storms to change us. So following Jesus doesn't exempt you from storms, it guarantees several. Now here's number 3. The third thing we learn from this storm, is that we need to seek God before the storm and you'll find him in it. Seek God before your storm and you'll find him in it. In verse 23, Jesus spends time alone with his Father. It's where he would gain insight and strength, apparently. He did this a lot. He did this before he chose the 12. He did this in Gethsemane. If Jesus needed to be with the Father before he faced storms, how much more so do we need to be with the Father before we face our storms? Now, I want you to look at these verses in your outline. Isaiah 55:6 says this, seek the Lord while he may be found, call upon him while he is near. Now, what's it saying? It's saying that sometimes he cannot be found. So you better seek him when he can be found. You better call upon him when he's near, because he's not always near in the sense this word's used here. So when he's near, call upon him. Find him before the storm. Know him and walk with him before the storm, and then it'll be no problem knowing and walking with him in your storm. Psalm 32:6. Let everyone who is godly pray to you, to God, in a time when you may be found. Surely in a flood of great waters they will not reach him. So if we need to seek the Lord while he may be found. When the sun's out and things are going our way, we have the opportunity to draw near to God. The Bible says he'll draw near to us, to get to know him and his truth. And if we do that before the storm comes, then we're equipped and ready to live through the storm we have to face. If you're walking with God before your storm, then you're likely to walk with him in it and through it. A storm is a bad time to try to catch up on your faith. So walk with him before the storm and you'll find him in it. Now, I know I'm using that because Jesus is going to fix the storm, but it's a principle of being with the Lord before the big thing happens that's going to be hard. Jesus did it, so surely we ought to do the same. Now, here's the fourth thing we learn from this passage. Storms work against us. Storms work against us. In verse 24, it says they were battered by the waves. Literally, the word is tormented. And that the wind was contrary. It's the word adverse. It was their adversary. Now, I want to give you some advice when your storm is working against you. And of course, all of our storms work against us. But here's some great advice that will help you through those times. 1, never let what you don't know get in the way of what you do know. The truth is, throughout our lives, hundreds, probably thousands of times, we won't understand. We don't know why this happened, why that didn't happen, why is this going on, why did God do that, why did God not do that? Hundreds of times, probably thousands of times. But never let what you don't know get in the way of what you do know. In fact, when you're facing what you don't know, hang on to what you do know. Well, I know this. God knows me. He loves me. He's good. He saved me. He's for me. He's going to give me grace and strength. He's going to protect me from more than I can handle. He's going to use bad for good in my life. One day he's going to get me out of here and take me to heaven. So when there's a lot that you don't know, hang on to what you do know. With this coronavirus, there's still so much we have no idea how it's going to play out. But you know what? We know a God who is unchanging. Even though we live in an uncertain time, we serve a God who is absolutely certain. And so you can get lost and drown in the uncertainties of life, or you can be stable and live on a solid rock on the certainty of a God who's unchanging. I suggest you do that. Now here's the second bit of advice. Never doubt in the darkness what God has shown you in the light. When things are good and God reveals His will to us, and then we follow His will, just like these disciples did, next thing you know, we're in a storm. And usually at that point, we start doubting, well, did I do the right thing? Is this really what God wanted me to do? And maybe God didn't lead this way, and all those kind of things. Never doubt in the darkness what God showed you in the light. When you're real emotional, never doubt what God showed you when you weren't real emotional. Now, here's the third one. Don't believe your doubts or doubt your beliefs. Believe your beliefs and doubt your doubts. Isn't it amazing how when storms come, we immediately start doubting what we believe and believing what we doubt? Why don't you instead believe what you believe and doubt what you doubt? These storms are going to work against us. But number 5, God uses storms to work for us. See, God is a redeemer. And He takes bad and makes it good. He takes curses and makes blessings out of them. He takes things that are against us and He makes them for us. What a God that is. So God takes what comes against us and then He uses it for us. In Romans 8, 28 and 29, it tells us that God uses even the bad things that happen to us to accomplish His purpose of conforming us to the image of His Son. In Deuteronomy 23:5, it says that the Lord our God will turn our curses into blessings because He loves us. In Hebrews 5:8, this is the most astounding verse of the Bible probably, it says that even Jesus learned obedience from the things which He suffered. Now, I don't even begin to know how to explain all that verse. But there was something Jesus was with suffering, with storms, that He apparently would not have been without them. God uses bad for good. It's a great story in Genesis. As you know, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. They were originally going to kill him, and then they decided to sell him. They could make a buck off of him. So he's sold into slavery, goes down to Egypt. Joseph, as you know, had dreams that he would be a ruler. People would bow down to him. Well, 13 years after he's been sold into Egypt, after things going from bad to worse there, he interprets a dream, becomes the prime minister of Egypt. And then there was a worldwide drought that God showed him was going to happen. And he starts collecting food to prepare Egypt for these lean years that are to come. And so as he's doing that, all of a sudden the drought comes and his own family back in Palestine has to come to Egypt for food. So they send the brothers. If you remember the story, he eventually sent for his father and all of his family. All that was Israel came down to Egypt, and Joseph took care of them. And then when Joseph's father died, the brothers came to Joseph and said, you know, Joseph before Dad died, he told us you ought to go easy on us. You know, that's basically what he was doing. And Joseph said this. I love both parts of it. He says, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't live in denial. He didn't try to pretend it was better than it was or something that it wasn't. He said, as for you, you guys meant evil against me. You knew exactly what you were doing. But God meant it for good. Now think about that. Even when your storm is a malicious attack by an evil person, God will take what was meant for evil and use it for good. If you'll trust Him with and in your storm. So God uses storms to work for us. Now, number 6. God shows up when you need Him, not when you wished He would. God shows up when you need Him, not when you wished He would. Now, one of the things I've learned about myself is I'm almost always in a hurry. I've got places to go, people to see, things to do. And one of the things I've learned about God is that He never is. He never is. Think about it. Jesus never got in a hurry. He let Lazarus die. And then before he dies, he says that he tells his Father, I have finished all the work you gave me to do. Now think about that. He never hurried, and yet he did every single thing God wanted him to do. But here's the deal. We may get in a hurry, but God doesn't. God will show up, and He'll show up on His time, but he'll almost never show up on your time. In verses 26 to 27, they were terrified and afraid before Jesus shows up walking on the water. He wasn't a moment early. He wasn't a moment late. In verses 30 to 31, Peter has walked on the water, got his eyes off the Lord, begun to sink, cries out, "Lord, save me," and Jesus is there and reaches down and picks him up. Jesus wasn't a moment early, and he wasn't a moment late. If you remember in the Old Testament, Abraham was an old man when he finally had a son that he had prayed for all of his life. And then when that son becomes a teenager, probably a late teenager, God tells him to go to a mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. And so Abraham does what God says. It says in Romans 4 that Abraham knew that God could raise him from the dead, because God told him that through that boy, there was going to be a great nation. So if Isaac died, God would have to work a miracle to keep his promise. But anyway, Abraham's going through with this. And they go up and they build the altar, they put the wood on there, and then Isaac is placed on it, and Abraham, his dad, has a knife about to stick it through him. And at that moment, not 2 minutes earlier, not 1 minute later, at the very moment, God shows up and he has a substitute waiting for Isaac in the brush. That's how God works. He won't be a moment early and he won't be a moment late. Now, you'll worry yourself into a grave if you think God is going to show up on your timetable. I'm just warning you. We want him to show up early, real early. Because if he'll show up early enough, we don't really have to have that much faith. He's trying to get us to trust him. Let's be honest. We do everything in our power to avoid having to just trust him. Don't we? We want money in the bank. We want our problems solved. We want everything fixed, everything in order, everything in line. We spend all of our lives trying to make sure we don't have to trust God to do something. We got it all worked out ourselves. And yet here's God working in our lives so that we will have to trust him. Why? Because it's only when we really have to trust him that we really get to know him. Number 7. The seventh thing we learn from this storm is that we experience God's peace when we recognize his presence. We experience his peace when we recognize his presence. It's implied in verse 27 and following that when they knew Jesus was there, they were okay. Peter was so okay, he wanted to take a walk on the water in the storm. The storm wasn't over yet. I mean, maybe one thing to walk on some water that's really, smooth and what we call, if you water ski, what you call glass. It's a whole nother thing to try to walk on the water in a raging storm. But because Jesus is there, Peter is so okay, he's willing to step out and do it. The storm is still raging. Jesus had not yet calmed the wind and the waves. The storm hasn't changed, but Jesus is here. We're okay now. The storm hasn't changed, but Jesus is here. We're okay now. I think I'm going to speak next Wednesday on how the recognition of God's presence makes life and us okay. It's the recognition of his presence. It's not what you wished you could have. Our peace is the absence of problems. Things are okay, so we're okay. God's peace is not the absence of problems, it's the awareness of his presence. Even though the storm is still raging and things weren't okay, they were okay. Once they know it's Jesus, there's no more fear. They're not afraid. This is what Philippians 4:7 tells us about. It says, the peace of God surpasses all comprehension, and it guards our hearts and our minds. It's a peace that's unexplainable, and what it does is it guards our hearts, our emotions, and it guards our minds. And when your mind and your emotions are guarded, you're okay. And being okay in a storm is a great place to be. And being okay does not require the storm going away. Being okay requires you knowing that the Lord is here. And so things may not look okay, things may not be okay, but I am okay. Now, number 8. Our failure to do what God says we can do is our failure, not His. Our failure to do what God says we can do is our failure, not His. Peter asked to walk on the water, and Jesus invites him out. Peter does great, but then his focus changes from Jesus to the storm. And in verse 30, he begins to sink. Jesus invited Peter to walk on the water. Don't go trying to walk on the water if Jesus hadn't invited you out there. All that Jesus asks us to do, He enables us to do. Peter didn't sink because he could no longer do what Jesus invited him to do, which was walk on the water. He didn't sink because Jesus wasn't able to do for Peter what Peter needed. Peter sank because of his own failure and focus. Now, this is very important. Keep listening closely. If Jesus asked you to do something, you can do it. Whatever Jesus asks you to do, He enables you to do. When Peter believed that what Jesus told him to believe, that he could walk on the water that day, then he was able to do what Jesus said he could do. God does give sufficient grace and strength for all that we have to face. Our failure to trust Him and to walk in that strength is no reflection on God, it's a reflection on us and our lack of faith. A fearful, failing Christian is no indicator of who God is or what He does. If you're living in fear during this storm, it's no indicator that God is unable to give you peace. It's an indicator that you lack trust in Him. Because you could have His peace, a peace that passes all comprehension, that guards your heart and your mind. And so if you say, well, I'm just frantic, I just can't settle down this. That's no indication of who God is or what He can and wants to do for you. It's an indication of you being unwilling to trust Him. Philippians 4:13 says, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Now, that doesn't mean we can fly like a bird. That means we can live underwater without oxygen. What it does mean is everything God asks us to do, we can do. Our failure to do what God says we can do, to be who God says we can be, to experience what God says we can experience, is our failure, not His. So when Peter sank, it had nothing to do with God's ability. It had everything to do with Peter's lack of faith. So Jesus said, why did you doubt? Now, number 9. We learn the most about God in our storms. We learn the most about God in our storms. The day before, the disciples had seen Jesus take a few fishes and loaves and feed probably 10 to 15,000 people, and then have 12 full baskets left over. They started with a little bit of food, fed this huge crowd. In our case, they fed Thompson Bowling Arena full. And when it was said and done, they had more food left over than they started with. That's quite the miracle, wouldn't you agree? They were surely impressed with Him, but none of them said anything about Him being divine. Listen closely. But then, they're in a storm. Then, they think they might die. Then, they experience Jesus in their storm. And look what they conclude in verse 33. Those who were in the boat worshiped Him, saying, you are certainly God's Son. So here's what I've just made the point of this point. You can learn things about God in a storm that even a miracle can't teach you. They didn't learn anything from that miracle. If they had, they'd have been trusting Him. But they've learned something in this storm. They've learned who Jesus is. In Isaiah 46:5, God says, to whom would you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we would be alike? Kind of like, yeah, who's like God? Well, nobody. Now, here's something I bet's going to surprise you. This story is told by Matthew, which is where we're reading, by Mark and John. If you go to this story in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John, Peter walking on the water isn't even mentioned. Isn't that surprising? I mean, think it's a big deal, isn't it? Well, it really isn't. It really isn't. The real story here is not the miracle of Peter walking on the water. It's the miracle of Jesus walking on the water and having power over a storm. That's the story. It's not about Peter and what he did. It's about who Jesus is. He is God's Son, God in the flesh, the Messiah, the Christ. You learn things in a storm about God that 100 miracles wouldn't teach you. Now let me give you 4 thoughts on living through these storms. Number 1, I like this first one. If your God is not bigger than your storm, then your God is not God. If your God is not bigger than your storm, then your God is not God. If your God can't handle this, then your God isn't God. If your God can't give you enough to be at peace with this, then your God isn't God. You serve a lesser being. We saw last week that God is infinitely greater than any storm we'll ever face. Not just greater, infinitely greater. He exists above and beyond our storms. Jeremiah 32:27, there God says, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me? And the implied answer is, well, of course not. If you can't trust your God in a storm, then you need a new God. Jesus walks on what drowns us. Jesus walks on what drowns us. That's the God we serve. And He's big enough and adequate enough for a storm 10 times the size of the one we face in America. And if your God's not big enough to handle the storm, you need a new God. You need the real God. Now here's number 2. We know about God through storms. We come to really know God, or we know about God without storms. We come to really know God through storms. We know about Him without storms. But it's in the storms we really come to know Him. See, God can be theoretical before a storm, but I need Him to be real in a storm. He can't just be a grand idea. He's got to be a living person who can do something in my world. Before our storm, we know what we can do for Him. Oh, here's how I serve the Lord. Here's what I do. In our storm, we discover what He can do for us and in us. Job arguably faced the biblical perfect storm. He lost his fortune. He was the richest man in the world, lost his fortune, his children, and his health. But he held on to God when his wife told him to let go. Job never gave up, but he had to feel like doing that. He never gave up, but he wanted to quit. It wasn't fair. Why would this happen to him? He was a righteous man. Even God said so. He didn't deserve this. It wasn't right. But he never let go of God. He held on. Eventually, Job's fortune was not only restored, it was doubled. God blessed him with a new batch of kids. He lost 7, gained 7. Job found God through his storm in a way that he did not know Him before his storm. Look in your outline of what it says in Job 42:5. And Job there, after all this, says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. There was a time when you were a great idea, and now I know you're a living person. There was a time when you were theoretical. I like the idea of God, but now you're real and practical. My eye sees you. Job chapters 1 and 2, where all those bad things happen, are just that. They're chapters in Job's life. The story ends with this statement in Job 41:17. And there it says, Job died an old man full of days. Now what that full of days statement is a Hebrew idiom that means a very happy man. He died a very happy man. How could you be happy when you lost your fortune? And he didn't get it back overnight, so he lived a long time without it. How could you be happy when you buried 7 children on the same day? How could you be happy when you were so sick that you probably in so much pain that you wanted to die? If you remember, his 3 friends came, and they sat there for 7 days just looking at him before they ever opened their mouths. I mean, he was in such agony, they wouldn't even open their mouths and say a word. You talk about some pain, but here he is dying a happy man. Even when your loss is as catastrophic as Job's was, God's grace really is sufficient. Happy people make the best of what is, they let go of what isn't, and they dream and work toward what might be. I will say that again. Happy people make the best of what is, they let go of what isn't, and they dream and work toward what might be. We know about God without storms, but we really come to know Him in our storms. Now, number 3. We can become good people without storms. We only become godly people through storms. We can become good people without storms, but we'll only become godly people through storms. I want you to turn your Bible to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I'll give you a minute to get there. We're going to read verses 5 through 11 and then 17 and 18. So here's the Apostle Paul. He says this: "For we do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord." In other words, it's not about me, it's not about us, it's about Him. "And we preach ourselves as your bondservants for Jesus' sake." We're just servants. "For God, who said, 'Light shall shine out of darkness,' is the one who has shone in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." In other words, He's real to us. "But we have this treasure," what's this treasure? The gospel, "in earthen vessels," literally cracked pots. Christians, we eat much. We're just a bunch of cracked pots. But the truth is, we have in us the answer to man's greatest problem, the gospel. We have this treasure in us, in this cracked pot. We have this treasure in earthen vessels so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not of ourselves. In other words, God's the big deal, not me. If you want to hear a great story, you don't want to hear mine. You want to hear His. And then he says this: "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not despairing. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body." In other words, we are suffering as He suffered. "For we who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. For momentary light affliction," now in verse 17, I love what he calls this, momentary light affliction. If you remember, Paul says in another place that he had been beaten so many times, he'd lost count of them. One time he was left for dead. It's probably when he went to heaven and came back. And he calls it momentary light affliction. Everywhere he went, the Jews followed him and caused riots and got him in trouble. He had people wanting to put him in jail and kill him. Momentary light affliction. And he says it's producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. In other words, what this is costing me ain't nothing compared to what I'm going to get for it. Verse 18. "While we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are unseen, not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Our eyes aren't on this life and the things of it. Our eyes are on the next life and the things of it. Now, the Apostle Paul is arguably the greatest Christian who ever lived. Jesus said that John the Baptist was the greatest man that ever lived. Paul wrote most of the good chunk of the New Testament. He probably was persecuted more and suffered more for Jesus than anybody else in history. In Paul's avalanche of storms, he walked with Jesus and he became like Jesus. If we allow them to, storms crush what needs to die in us. They crush what needs to die in us. Ego, pride, selfishness. Look at what Jesus said in John 12:24. And there he says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now, Jesus is primarily using this metaphor to describe his own death. He will die, and as a result of his death, his followers and his fruitfulness will multiply. I also believe that he uses this picture in reference to us dying to ourselves. Sometimes dying to ourselves is a choice that we understand and choose. Well, I know I need to not try to get my way and let them have their way, so I'm going to die to myself. Sometimes we choose it. Storms, though, press us to die to ourselves. Storms mean that life isn't the way we wished it was. Storms mean that I'm not getting what I want in my way. Storms force me to give up or grow up. Storms strip me of my love for things that I care too much about. Storms show me that my greatest need is Jesus. It's not relief. It's not escape. It's not money. It's not some person. It's Him. A part of giving God complete control of your life is realizing your inability to control life. Storms make people who thought they were strong weak. And being weak, we begin to trust in the one who is strong. We trust in Him rather than ourselves. We lean into God's sufficiency, and thereby we become strong. 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul was told by God that God's power is perfected in weakness. Listen, all godly people have weathered and walked through God with storms, and usually lots of them. All godly people have weathered and walked through storms with God, usually lots of them. Lots of them. Now here's the fourth thing. Give your storm a glance, but give God your gaze. Give your storm a glance, but give God your gaze. When Peter had his eye on Jesus, he walked on water. When he had his eyes on the storm, he sank. What you focus on will gain spiritual, emotional, and mental power over you. That's why it says in Hebrews 12:2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, even though He despised the shame, and now He's sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. When they're teaching counterfeiters how to spot counterfeit money, they don't study counterfeit money. They study the real thing. And they're so familiar with the real bill that if anything's off, they see it. And maybe I'm a yard guy, spray weeds. I've already been spraying and all that kind of stuff, getting the weeds out. And what I do is I walk through the yard and everything that doesn't look like grass is a weed, right? I spray it. And so that's how you know. What you focus on is what will determine how you feel and what you think. That's part of why we have to forgive. Why? Because if you don't forgive somebody, they're going to be what you focus on. And the person who hurt you will continue to control you. So you don't forgive them to let them off the hook. You forgive them to get yourself off the hook. So we fix our eyes on Jesus. If you focus on, gaze at your problem will seem to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. If you focus on God, your faith in Him will grow, and you'll begin to see Him as He is, listen, infinitely bigger than whatever you're facing. Infinitely bigger than whatever you're facing. So glance at your storm, your problem, and gaze at God. Worship is seeing God as He is. And when you see Him as He is, you will see your storm as it is, and it is infinitely less than Him. Let me just give you some practical advice. Some of you are watching the news, and every night what the president says, what the governor says, what the mayor says, and all the rest. Why don't you just make a deal that for every minute you spend watching the coronavirus news, you'll spend 5 in the Word. It'll revolutionize your life. But some of you are drowning because all you're doing is worrying. You're praying, but you're not praying. You're just worrying yourself to God. That's where your gaze is. You're fixed on that. And it's terrifying you because it looks bigger than He is. Glance at your problem and then gaze at God. He's infinitely bigger than this and anything you'll ever face. And if He isn't, you need to forget you knew God, a real one. Now, 2 things and we're finished. First, Our biggest problem with walking with God is that we too often have two different agendas. Our agenda, let's be honest, is to be blessed, avoid pain, and experience pleasure. Am I in the right room? Am I on the right TV? I mean, isn't that what we do? We want to get blessed, we want to avoid anything that's painful, and we want to experience pleasure. God's agenda, that's not His agenda. His agenda is to make us like Himself. Now, I take tennis lessons from a pro at the racket club. His agenda is to get me to prepare earlier and move more so I can hit the ball better. Now, the problem is I have a different agenda. My agenda is I'm trying to figure out how I can play tennis while sitting in a lawn chair and not moving. And so you see, we got two diametrically opposed agendas. And the truth is, God's agenda is diametrically opposed to many of your agendas. What you want most is to be blessed, to avoid pain, and experience pleasure. And you know what will bring you greater joy than that will ever bring you? Becoming like Him. In fact, if you become like Him, you won't need any of the three to have joy. Look back at Hebrews 2:12. For the joy set before Him, He endured the cross. Jesus had joy at the cross. But if your agenda is avoiding problems, and God's agenda is conforming you to the image of His Son, then no wonder this is not going so well. God's agenda with you is to conform you to the image of His Son, to make you like Jesus. And what does He use to do that? Pain, suffering, difficulty, trials, storms. What He uses are all the things we do everything in our power to avoid. We consider difficulties that can bless us to be curses that will harm us. Our blessings may give us temporary happiness, but blessings don't build character. They're more likely to make us proud and give us a sense of entitlement. But pain and suffering, boy, they can change your life. When Jacob wrestled with the angel, he thought that one who was there to bless him was there to harm him, probably to kill him. But during the struggle, somewhere along the way, he recognized that this enemy was a friend. That this person was not here to harm him. This person was here to bless him. And if you remember, he did bless him, knocked his hip out of joint. But that day, Jacob the scoundrel became Israel the prince. And his life was never the same. What he thought was going to kill him was there to bless him. In his case, he figured it out. And he said, I will not let go until you bless me. You will continue to struggle with God until you embrace His agenda for your life. You'll be unhappy with Him because you think it's your job, it's His job to serve you, bless you, keep you from pain, give you pleasure. Make sure you experience everything you want to experience. And God has a whole different agenda that involves things that you want to avoid. But if He can get you on His agenda, He can make you into something that's bigger than all the things you think you want most now. Let me tell you what you want more than anything. And I know it's true because God made you that way. More than anything possible, what you want is to know Him the best you can know Him and to be like Him. And that'll give you greater joy and greater fulfillment and greater satisfaction and greater purpose and greater meaning than if you had the whole world and forfeited your soul. Now, the last thing I will say is this. When Peter started to sink, he cried out to Jesus for help. Jesus was there. He rescued Peter, and He can rescue you. If you're not a believer in and a follower of Jesus who has the afterlife question answered, remember where we started? If you're ready to die, then you're ready to live. If I'm not ready to die, I spend my whole life trying not to die. But when I'm ready to die, I can be freed up to just go ahead and live. If I die, I die. Paul says it's gain. We go to heaven. I win. So I don't have to be afraid of death. But if I don't know the Lord, honestly, I legitimately ought to be terrified of death. And so whether it's coronavirus plague or it's a drive-by shooting or it's a car wreck or it's a bad doctor's report or whatever else it is, until you're ready to die, you're never ready to live. You ought to be driven by fear. It's normal. You say, well, I'm scared to death. You ought to be. But I got to tell you, I'm not scared to death. If I got this thing and die, I win. And every believer, that's true of them. So you've got to answer this what happens when I die question. If you'll give your life to Jesus, then you can live in absolute peace every day of your life. In the high times and in the low times. In the up times, in the down times. In the bull market, in the bear market. When unemployment is at record lows, and when unemployment is at record highs. When your 401k has topped out at the max it's ever been at, or when the bottom's dropped out of it. Jesus, who is unchanging, can give you stability in a world no matter how desperately and how much it should change. And if your God can't do that for you, you need to find you a real one, because Jesus can do that for you. And Jesus won't just get you to heaven when you die. You know what he'll do? He'll get you through this storm and the next and the next and the next until you get there.